In 1954, an airplane flew over the capital of Guatemala, dropping pamphlets and firing warning shots over the rooftops. It was not a war between countries. It was a coup d'etat organized in Washington to protect the business of a single company. A company that sold fruit. How did a fruit that costs 20 cents in any supermarket end up overthrowing governments? The answer begins much earlier, in a place that has nothing to do with Central America. In New Guinea, about 7,000 years ago, farming communities domesticated a wild plant full of hard seeds, almost inedible, until they transformed it generation after generation into something sweet, soft, and practically seedless. The banana, as you know it today, does not exist in nature. It is literally a human invention. From New Guinea, the crop slowly spread through Southeast Asia, and Arab merchants took it to East Africa centuries before any European knew it existed. It arrived in America much later, brought by Portuguese and Spanish settlers in the 10th century, but for 300 years, the banana was just one more fruit among many. Nothing special. Nothing that would change the destiny of entire countries. That changed in the 19th century, and it changed for a very specific reason. The railroad and the refrigerated steamboat allowed, for the first time, the transportation of perishable fruit over long distances without it rotting along the way. And that is where a man enters the scene who would literally decide the political destiny of several countries. Minor Cooper Keith, an American businessman, built a railroad in Costa Rica at the end of the 19th century. Theoretically intended to transport coffee, the government paid him for part of the work with something that at the time seemed like a worthless favor. Enormous tracts of land along the tracks. Keith planted bananas on those lands, almost as a side project to generate income while finishing the railroad. That secondary crop ended up being more profitable than the railroad itself. In 1899, Keith's company merged with another fruit company from Boston, and the United Fruit Company was born. And this is the part of the story that almost no one outside of Central America knows. United Fruit did not just buy land to grow bananas. It bought railroads. It bought ports. It bought telegraph lines. In several countries, the company came to control more infrastructure than the national government itself. In Guatemala and Honduras, people started calling it simply the octopus, because its tentacles reached everywhere. Politics, the press, the courts. Sam Zemery, a Russian immigrant who had started selling ripe bananas from a cart in Alabama, became one of United Fruit's biggest competitors. In 1910, the Honduran government raised taxes on fruit exports, which directly threatened his profits. Zemery did not protest in any court. He hired a private army of mercenaries, including a famous gunfighter named Lee Christmas. He boarded them on an armed yacht, and in 1911 overthrew the Honduran government to install a president favorable to his interests in its place. This decision, solving a tax problem with a private coup d'etat financed by a fruit company, seemed like an isolated case. It was not. Decades later, Zemery sold his company to United Fruit in exchange for stock, thus becoming its largest shareholder. Years later, when the company went into crisis, he used those shares to take control himself and become its director. The company, which had once been his competitor, ended up being his. By then, United Fruit no longer needed armed mercenaries on a yacht. It was enough to control the press, finance political campaigns, and directly pressure American officials. The company even had permanent representatives in Washington, whose sole job was to ensure that no Central American government touched its interests. In countries like Guatemala and Honduras, presidents knew that governing against United Fruit could cost them their jobs, or worse. In 1928, in Colombia, thousands of United Fruit plantation workers in the Ciénaga region went on strike, demanding written contracts, 8-hour workdays, and minimum safety conditions. The Colombian army, pressured by the company and the United States government, opened fire on the crowd, gathered in the town square. The exact number of dead was never known with certainty. The figures range from several dozen to several thousand, depending on the source. Because the bodies were taken away at night on freight trains. Decades later, Colombian writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez turned that massacre into one of the central scenes of his novel 100 Years of Solitude, ensuring that the whole world would eventually know, even if through fiction, what his own country had tried to bury. If you are finding this story interesting, hit subscribe. Every week, we bring you one more, but the most ambitious operation of all was yet to come. And this time, it was not a company acting alone. It was a company that got the United States government to act for it. In 1950, the president-elect of Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz, pushed for an agrarian reform that expropriated, with financial compensation, uncultivated land from large landowners to distribute among landless peasants. United Fruit was by far the largest landowner in the country, and a good part of its lands were precisely uncultivated, kept as a speculative reserve. The company considered the reform an existential threat. United Fruit had direct connections at the highest level of the American government. The then Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, had been a lawyer for the company for years, and his brother Alan Dulles, director of the CIA, had been a member of its board of directors. The company financed an intense campaign to convince Washington that Arbenz was a communist threat in the United States' backyard in the middle of the Cold War. In 1954, the CIA organized and financed Operation PB Success, a coup d'etat that overthrew Arbenz and replaced him with a military dictatorship aligned with the company's interests. The agrarian reform was immediately reversed. Guatemala entered a cycle of authoritarian governments and political violence that would last in different forms for the next 4 decades, including a civil war that would leave more than 200,000 dead, all for a fruit that today costs less than a coffee. While this was happening in Central America, the banana industry was experiencing its own silent threat, this time biological instead of political. During the first half of the 20th century, practically all the bananas exported in the world were of a single variety, the Gros Michel, prized for its sweet taste and transport-resistant skin. But a fungus called Fusarium, known as Panama disease, began to ravage the plantations from the 1900s onwards, and by the 1950s and 60s, it had destroyed so many plantations that the variety became commercially unviable on a large scale. The industry urgently needed an alternative and found it in a fungus-resistant variety, blender but more robust, the Cavendish. That is, almost certainly, the only variety of banana you have ever eaten in your life. Even though there are more than 1,000 different varieties of this fruit in the world, and here is the twist that very few people know. The Cavendish, exactly like the Gros Michel before it, is grown in an almost genetically cloned way in plantations all over the planet because commercial bananas do not reproduce by seed, but by identical cuttings. And for years, a new strain of the same Panama disease, known as Tropical Race 4, has been advancing through plantations in Asia, Africa, and now Latin America as well, without there yet being a replacement variety on par with the Cavendish in taste and transport resistance. History could repeat itself, and this time, there is no obvious plan B waiting in the laboratory. There is something else that stands out about this story, and that is the price. The banana has cost practically the same in Western supermarkets for more than 3 decades. Something almost unique among staple foods that usually rise in price with inflation, that artificially low and stable price is no coincidence. It reflects the enormous negotiating power of a few multinationals against millions of small producers who absorb most of the business risk in exchange for a tiny fraction of the final price. Today, the banana is the most exported fruit on the planet and one of the most consumed, with more than 100 million tons produced every year. India is the world's largest producer, although most of its production is consumed domestically and not exported. Ecuador, the Philippines, and Guatemala dominate global exports. And companies like Chiquita, a direct heir to that United Fruit Company, and Dole continue to control a large part of the global distribution chain. If this story has surprised you, subscribe. Every week we unearth one more